discussions on learning, which have been very central to this forum. Learning about ourselves as defenders and educators, about the needs, realities, and agency of others, people we work with and for. The input this morning of Lajos, the Commissioner for Educational Rights in Hungary, was very interesting in capturing a very important point reflected in many of the different groups. He was talking about what has happened in Hungarian schools, where in order to guarantee the right of education, the civil liberties of students have been infringed. Compulsory drug tests for all, so that people can be educated in a school where they're not interrupted by people who are on drugs. So it's not just that rights clash, we know this, but that when we talk about progress in human rights, it isn't a line through time. Many discussions in the forum have reflected how respect for rights takes 2 steps forward, 1 back, 3 back, 1 forward, sometimes sideways. How some forms of racism have been strongly confronted and others have once again become acceptable. How the situation of sexual minorities has both improved and disimproved, sometimes in the same regions. In some contexts, as Andre pointed out this morning, power is so brutal, it makes it hard to connect this thing called human rights. In other contexts, power is invisible. Take the discussions on gender equality. Everybody agrees gender equality is a good thing, but they also think it's been achieved. So stop complaining, stop being so politically correct, and get on with it. How can you be discriminated against when we've told you we don't discriminate in the West? Across most of these contexts, these steps forward and back and sideways, at least in what I've noticed so far, have been structured by the tensions in education that Rui outlined in the plenary yesterday, between state and civil society, between teachers and learners, between practitioners and supporters, between the formal and the non-formal. And these, of course, have different dimensions. Let's take, just as an example, the relationship between teachers, broadly understood, and learners. 2 minutes, Rui? About 2 minutes Irish time. Shamelessly stereotype yourself when you're in trouble. And now stop laughing. Because a recurring question has been how to make human rights education real for people whose rights are being violated. And it's interesting that the corollary, a logical consequence of this that came out this morning, was Andre's question about how to avoid the risks of junk education, education that has nothing to do with the realities that people live in. And I heard this in many groups, expressed in terms both of small steps and achievements, but also frustrations about how to bring human rights education to people who live, for example, outside big cities and outside the scope of networks. How to have access to them, how to translate issues and resources in ways that make sense, that meet their needs and realities, and also how to deal with the consequences of doing this, of being successful and unsuccessful. Both of these have consequences. I hope it's not too romantic to draw 2 small vignettes, 2 small pictures of things that I heard in the groups, but they struck me very strongly. On the one hand, there was a discussion of human rights education with children in Palestine, where somebody said, well, how can I discuss this with them when we simply do not have these rights? How can I answer their question when we do not have them? Empty words, if not false promises, as the message said. But then on the other hand, there was a discussion of Compass as a resource, as an educational resource, but suddenly as something more than an educational resource in the group on Romophobia and anti-Gypsyism, where somebody said, when I held Compass in my hands, it wasn't just a resource, it was proof that rights existed. They were literally in my hands. So because of this, and because of the complexity, and because I think of the beauty of some of these small moments, I was a little bit surprised that the debate on formal, non-formal education was as one-dimensional and as abstract sometimes as it was. There really is nothing to be gained from abstract formal, non-formal debates that aren't in context in terms of real schools, real practices, and real people. There's a very simple answer in some ways to this dichotomy. Both sectors have good and bad practices, both can work together with some realism and some planning, and all sectors have a role to play. But strangely missing is solidarity with teachers. We heard a lot about schools as communities, which is a warm and fuzzy word that makes us feel good inside. But we didn't hear a lot about schools as institutions. And the character of institutions is that they discipline everybody within them. School curricula, we heard from many people, are marked by ideas of what is valuable to study, what is useful to study, what is unpatriotic and therefore not worth studying, what is nice but not that important in a knowledge economy. We heard heard how in post-Soviet contexts, human rights education must deal with the historic suspicion of social and economic rights, and with a powerful feeling that human rights are not compatible with educating good, patriotic citizens. But we also heard how in Western European systems, human rights are pressurized by, human rights education is pressurized almost out of existence by assessments and standardization. Of course, we also heard about many successes that changed the nature of this opposition between formal and non-formal, and this is where I'd like to finish. I was struck by the creativity of many participants in getting around not just the dichotomy of formal and non-formal, but getting around it in actual contexts. So, for example, you have management or parents who are suspicious of human rights education, change the name and do it anyway. The school doesn't see human rights as part of the curriculum, bring in NGOs to talk to students and show the school how they can then participate, and the school is happy to see the students organizing extracurricular activities. A lot of creativity in these little moves. Finally then, and to finish, we should have a last word on learning here, not just learning as content, but learning as a process. And it was said to me, interestingly, that it was a little bit absurd to hear criticisms of formal education in a non-formal roundtable organized pretty much like the stereotype we all had of formal education, top-down and controlled from beginning to end. Do as we do as we say, barbaro, whatever. Human rights education is challenging, not only because of demands of knowledge, attitudes, and values, but also what was constantly coming out in terms of learning is how other areas of non-formal education are indivisible from human rights education. In the intercultural dialogue group, there was a constant reflection on how do we discuss here in this room without putting people in boxes that they're not comfortable with or boxes that they reject. How do we reflect on how you identify yourself and I identify you? Are you from the Middle East or are you from the Arab world? Are you someone I identify as disabled or as disabled by society? So the challenge of human rights education is also the challenge of other areas of non-formal education, and it's the challenge of ethics that one group mentioned here. And then finally, acting, you've already said more than I can say in it in the recommendations. There's a massive guidelines that we now need to translate. There are resources there to be used and adapted. There's instruments to be applied. There's a superb motivating idea in terms of the right to human rights education, and soon a charter to support it. And very soon, hopefully, there will be Barbaro on the boat and floating fireworks. And thank you.